Why you don't want to do anything anymore. Jung explains your soul's message. If you've been feeling the urge to lie down all day and withdraw from the world, this is not laziness. Jung says it's your soul trying to speak to you loudly, and everything you're feeling right now has a deeper meaning than you realize. Part 1. When your body wants to lie down all day, the first signal from the unconscious. The persistent desire to lie down all day is often misunderstood as laziness, burnout, or a lack of discipline. But from a Jungian perspective, this impulse is not simply physical, it is psychological and symbolic. Jung believed that the body and the psyche communicate constantly, and whenever a behavior becomes repetitive or unusually strong, it represents a message rising from the unconscious. When you feel the urge to withdraw from movement, effort, and external responsibilities, the psyche might be expressing tension, fragmentation, or the beginning of a deeper internal process that your ego has not yet acknowledged. The body becomes the messenger of what the conscious mind avoids, resists, or suppresses. Lying down becomes a symbolic posture, a retreat, a surrender, a return to the ground, a regression to safety, and a refusal to participate in a world that no longer aligns with who you are. Jung emphasized that psychological energy libido is not only sexual or emotional, it is the fuel that drives every part of human functioning. When this energy becomes blocked, misdirected, or pulled inward, the individual experiences fatigue, loss of motivation, and the desire to lie still. It is a sign that the psyche is reorganizing itself. This reorganization can happen when you experience emotional overload, identity conflict, persistent self-denial, or an unconscious tension between the persona you present to the world and your authentic self. In such cases, lying down becomes a protective mechanism, an instinctive attempt to conserve energy, while the unconscious works in the background to repair or restructure what has been destabilized. The desire to lie down all day often appears in periods of psychological transition where the ego feels overwhelmed by demands it can no longer satisfy. This may happen when you have been carrying responsibilities beyond your emotional capacity, when you have been suppressing your true feelings for too long, or when you have lost touch with meaning. Jung described such internal conflicts as psychic congestion, a buildup of unresolved material that blocks the flow of life energy. The outward symptom looks like exhaustion, but the interior reality is emotional overload. The body retreats because the psyche needs silence. The urge to withdraw from activity is not simply the desire for rest. It is a retreat into symbolic hibernation. Jung used the metaphor of the unconscious, calling the ego back home, urging the individual to stop running, stop performing, and stop pretending. In this sense, lying down all day is a form of involuntary introspection. The psyche pulls energy away from the outside world and directs it inward, where unresolved conflicts, unexpressed emotions, or unrealized potentials require attention. The unconscious often expresses itself through physical impulses, because the mind and body are not separate systems, they are intertwined aspects of the same deeper psyche. Jung believed that when a person refuses to face their emotional condition consciously, the psyche expresses the issue through physical symptoms. This concept, known as somatization, means that psychological problems manifest in bodily experiences. The desire to lie down can therefore signal the presence of emotional weight, grief, anxiety, frustration, fear, or internal conflict that has accumulated without release. The body becomes heavy because the mind is carrying too much that has not been processed. A person may feel drained not because of a lack of sleep, but because they are fighting an internal war. The fatigue is real, but the source is invisible. When someone consistently feels like lying down, Jung would view this behavior as symbolic regression, a pull towards safety, stillness, and containment. Regression is not always negative. In Jungian psychology, regression can be purposeful, offering the psyche an opportunity to reorganize. When the ego is overwhelmed, the psyche may temporarily retreat into earlier, simpler, or safer symbolic states. Lying down resembles returning to the womb, warmth, stillness, protection, no demands. In modern life, the pressure to constantly perform, produce, and respond leaves no room for such psychological regression. The psyche then forces the retreat physically by draining motivation and compelling stillness. Jung saw this as the unconscious trying to restore balance after prolonged psychological strain. Another crucial aspect of Jung's analysis is the relationship between the ego and the unconscious. The ego is responsible for daily functioning social roles and rational decisions, but the unconscious carries emotions, instincts, desires, memories, and unprocessed trauma. When the ego becomes disconnected from the unconscious for too long, the psyche destabilizes. This imbalance manifests as emotional numbness, demotivation, desire to isolate, and the wish to withdraw from life. The desire to lie down can be an early sign that the ego has lost alignment with deeper needs. It is not laziness, it is the soul signaling neglect. Jung taught that whenever a symptom appears repeatedly, it must not be dismissed but decoded. What triggers the desire to lie down? What thoughts appear when you are horizontal? What do you wish to escape? What internal voice becomes louder when everything else is silent? These questions point toward the root of the psychic withdrawal. Another Jungian interpretation is related to the collapse of the persona. The persona is the mask we wear for society, the identity we present to meet expectations and maintain social belonging. But when the persona becomes too rigid, too demanding, or too disconnected from the true self, it drains psychological energy. You may project confidence while feeling insecure, act strong while feeling fragile, or pretend to be okay while carrying unresolved pain. The persona becomes exhausting. Maintaining a false identity consumes more energy than living authentically. When the persona collapses or becomes unsustainable, the individual feels depleted. Jung saw this collapse as an unconscious rebellion. The psyche refuses to support a role that no longer serves your psychological growth. The desire to lie down all day often emerges in such moments. Your soul is withdrawing energy from the mask you have been wearing, signaling that a transformation is near. Fatigue associated with lying down can also be traced to the shadow, the part of your psyche that contains the emotions, desires, and traits you suppress because they contradict your desired identity. Maintaining suppression requires energy, and when the shadow grows too heavy, the ego cannot sustain control. Jung observed that people experience exhaustion when they suppress anger, sadness, resentment, disappointment, or fear for too long. The shadow becomes a psychological weight pulling you toward the ground. Each time you lie down, something inside you wants relief from the burden of pretending. You may think you're simply tired, but the exhaustion may stem from holding back tears, silencing your frustrations, or maintaining peace at the cost of your well-being. Lying down becomes the moment where the mask falls off and the shadow breathes. There is also the issue of meaning. Jung argued that modern individuals often suffer not from clinical depression, but from a collapse of meaning. When life loses personal significance, when your work, relationships, or routines feel empty, you lose psychological energy. The body mirrors this loss through heaviness and stillness. Lying down represents not only fatigue but a symbolic surrender to an existential void. People who lack meaning move slowly, speak softly, think vaguely, and withdraw from action. They feel like lying down because standing in the world feels pointless. Jung believed that the absence of meaning starves the soul. The unconscious then attempts to communicate through symptoms that force the individual to slow down and reflect. The lie-down impulse may be the psyche's way of asking, what are you living for? What nourishes you? What is missing? Until these questions are confronted, the energy remains blocked. Jung also connected the desire for stillness to the archetype of the Great Mother. This archetype symbolizes rest, comfort, nourishment, protection, and the return to the ground. When you crave lying down, it may represent a deep longing for psychological safety. The ground symbolizes foundation and stability. Lying down brings you into contact with gravity, with solidity, with the earth. It represents a desire to be held supported and unburdened. In Jung's view, this archetypal pull emerges when you feel overwhelmed by external demands or emotionally unsupported. The psyche seeks the archetypal mother because the ego cannot carry its responsibilities alone. Lying down thus becomes a symbolic return to a nurturing presence, even when no such presence exists externally. In some individuals, the desire to lie down aligns with the archetype of death, not literal death, but symbolic death. Symbolic death represents the end of an old identity belief system or psychological phase. Jung saw moments of deep fatigue as an early sign of psychological death and rebirth. Before something new emerges, the old must dissolve. Activities that once motivated you no longer feel meaningful. Social interactions feel draining. Goals lose their spark. The psyche withdraws because the previous version of you is dying internally. Lying down signals the beginning of this death process. You feel the ground because you are returning to psychological zero, preparing for transformation. This is not a failure, it is individuation beginning. But because society stigmatizes rest and introspection, many people misunderstand this stage and judge themselves harshly. Jung insisted that symbolic death is necessary for psychological growth. The desire to lie down frequently appears in individuals experiencing emotional conflict between their conscious beliefs and unconscious truth. For example, someone may believe they are strong while unconsciously feeling fragile, believe they are successful while feeling unfulfilled, or believe they are in control while feeling overwhelmed. These contradictions drain energy. Jung warned that the unconscious will eventually override the ego's narrative. The body expresses the truth the mind denies. Lying down becomes a form of surrender to what is real, not what the ego wishes to be true. The psyche stops cooperating with illusions. This forced rest is a way for the unconscious to realign the individual with their authentic inner state. For many people, the urge to lie down comes from chronic emotional suppression. Jung observed that unresolved emotional material sinks into the unconscious, where it grows heavier over time. Individuals who never allow themselves to feel sadness eventually drown in numbness. Those who avoid anger become exhausted from holding it in. Those who constantly act strong become depleted from their own performance. The accumulated emotional residue weakens psychological energy and manifests as fatigue. Lying down becomes a refuge, a pause from the constant effort of emotional control. Jung saw this as a sign that the emotional burden has surpassed the ego's capacity. The psyche uses fatigue to force a pause, offering the individual a moment to feel what has long been buried. Jung also believed that a persistent desire to lie down can arise when the individual is living out of alignment with their true nature. This misalignment may involve staying in toxic relationships, pursuing a career that contradicts your values, forcing yourself into roles that suffocate your identity, or denying your creative impulses. When you live contrary to your inner truth, your psyche withdraws cooperation. It stops providing energy for inauthentic pursuits. The desire to lie down becomes a protest, a form of psychological resistance. The body refuses to participate in a life that betrays the soul. Jung wrote that when a person lives falsely, the unconscious will intervene through symptoms that disrupt daily functioning. Lying down is one such disruption. It is the psyche's way of saying, this path is not yours. Finally, Jung would view the desire to lie down all day as a call to introspection. The unconscious uses discomfort to draw attention inward. When you lie down, distractions disappear. You are no longer performing or interacting. You are alone with your thoughts, feelings, and inner world. Some people fear this inner world, so they stay busy. But when the psyche wants to be heard, it will remove your energy for external activities. Lying down becomes the only position where the ego is quiet enough for the unconscious to speak. In this stillness, you may notice insights, memories, or emotions rising. Jung called this the threshold of inner dialogue. The psyche wants you to listen, and fatigue is the price of ignoring it. Part 2. What your soul wants you to realize: shadow fatigue, persona exhaustion, and the hidden truth behind your desire to lie down. When the desire to lie down all day becomes a recurring pattern, Jung would not interpret it as weakness, but as a psychological message from the depths of the unconscious. The soul communicates quietly, symbolically, and often through discomfort rather than words. If you have been living in a way that contradicts your emotional truth, your psyche will send signals, subtle at first, then increasingly persistent, to force you to pay attention. Lying down all day is one of these signals. It represents a breakdown in the usual equilibrium between your conscious identity and your unconscious needs. Jung believed that every symptom carries meaning, and fatigue is no exception. When you cannot bring yourself to stand, move, or engage with life, the soul is attempting to redirect your awareness inward. One of the most powerful explanations Jung gives for the compulsion to lie down is shadow fatigue. The shadow contains all the emotions, impulses, memories, and traits that you reject or refuse to acknowledge. Every time you suppress anger when you should set boundaries, stay silent when you want to speak, pretend to be fine when you're hurt, or act strong, while feeling fragile, you push energy into the shadow. The more you suppress, the heavier the shadow becomes. Eventually, the weight is so great that the psyche can no longer function normally. You feel heavy, drained, unmotivated, and unable to stand in your own life. Lying down becomes a symbolic collapse under the weight of everything you've pushed away. Shadow fatigue doesn't look dramatic. It looks quiet, dull, and persistent. You don't explode, you deflate. The soul whispers, "I cannot carry this anymore." Your desire to lie down becomes the clearest expression of how tired your inner world has become. Jung emphasized that ignoring the shadow always has a cost. The unconscious does not disappear when neglected, it simply becomes more demanding. It grows restless and disruptive. Shadow fatigue feels like emotional numbness, like moving through life underwater, like having the energy sucked out of your body. You are not just tired, you are psychologically burdened. Lying down becomes a form of surrender, not to laziness, but to the truth you've been avoiding. Jung believed that the shadow carries exactly what you most need to heal, but the ego resists because the truth is uncomfortable. Yet if you refuse to face your shadow consciously, your psyche expresses the truth through your body. The desire to lie down is often the body revealing the emotions you refuse to feel. Another deep reason behind the urge to lie down is persona exhaustion. The persona is the role you play in society, the mask you wear to be accepted, admired, or safe. The persona is necessary, but when it becomes too dominant or too fake, it consumes your energy. If you constantly pretend to be cheerful, productive, helpful, accommodating, patient, confident, or strong, even when you feel the opposite, the persona drains your life force. Maintaining a facade is exhausting. Jung wrote that many people collapse internally because the persona has become an overdeveloped mask, suffocating the true self beneath it. When this happens, the psyche withdraws energy from the persona to protect the deeper identity. You then feel tired, detached, unmotivated, and unable to keep your performance going. Lying down is the unconscious tearing the mask off, forcing you to stop performing. The soul refuses to continue in a role that betrays your authenticity. Persona exhaustion often appears in people who feel the pressure to be everything for everyone. Strong for the family, stable for loved ones, competent at work, emotionally available for friends, always reliable, always resilient. Jung argued that the psyche punishes over-identification with the persona by withdrawing libido from external life. You feel like you want to lie down because there is no energy left to maintain the performance. In this state, even simple tasks feel overwhelming, not because you are incapable, but because you have been functioning under a false identity for too long. The soul demands rest so it can realign with the true self. Jung taught that the collapse of the persona is not failure, it is liberation. But until you recognize this collapse, the desire to lie down persists. Another reason Jung gives for the urge to lie down relates to what modern psychology calls silent depression. This is not the dramatic, overt sadness that people express openly. It is the quiet, invisible form of emotional depletion that slowly drains the spirit. Silent depression appears when you continue to push forward, pretend everything is fine, force positivity, or avoid your true emotions. You may still function, but inside your soul is numb. You do not cry, but you no longer feel joy. You do not break down, but you no longer feel alive. Jung identified this state as an internal shutting down. The psyche protects itself by numbing emotional pain, but the side effect is the collapse of vitality. The body mirrors this collapse through fatigue, heaviness, and the desire to withdraw from the world. Lying down becomes the body's call for psychological stillness. Silent depression often comes from unresolved losses, unacknowledged disappointments, or the slow erosion of hope. When you live through emotional experiences without processing them, breakups, betrayals, failures, loneliness, chronic stress, you accumulate unseen wounds. Jung believed that these wounds gather in the unconscious and eventually pull down your psychological energy. Your desire to lie down represents a retreat into safety, a withdrawal from overstimulation, and a temporary shutting down of the psychological system to prevent further harm. This is not cowardice. It is self-preservation. Your soul lies down because standing in life has become too painful. Jung also described a deeper, more existential cause for the desire to lie down: the loss of inner meaning. Meaning is the fuel of the psyche. When life feels meaningless, the psyche has nothing to energize itself with. Activities become empty. Conversations feel dull, responsibilities feel heavy, and motivation disappears. You feel like lying down because you see no purpose in getting up. Jung believed that modern individuals often struggle not with mental illness but with a spiritual void. When you no longer know why you are doing what you do, your soul withdraws energy from everyday life. The body becomes heavy because your spirit is unanchored. Meaning cannot be forced or manufactured. It must be rediscovered through introspection. The desire to lie down is the psyche's way of inviting you to question the direction of your life. What matters to you? What feels empty? What no longer resonates? Until you answer these questions, your energy remains blocked. Another layer behind the urge to lie down is the internal conflict between your conscious self and your unconscious truth. Jung observed that whenever a person lives in contradiction with their inner nature, the psyche generates symptoms that reflect this conflict. You may believe you are okay while unconsciously feeling broken. You may act strong while unconsciously craving support. You may appear confident while feeling insecure inside. This contradiction creates tension that drains energy. The unconscious tries to correct the imbalance by slowing you down. Lying down becomes a symbolic correction, a way for the psyche to reduce the friction between the persona and the shadow. The soul pulls you out of activities that contradict your real emotional state. Jung warned that ignoring these contradictions leads to chronic fatigue, emotional detachment, and psychic numbness. A profound Jungian explanation for the desire to lie down is archetypal withdrawal. Archetypes are universal patterns of psychological behavior. When you lie down, certain archetypes are activated. One is the archetype of the hermit, the inner figure that seeks solitude, reflection, and detachment from external life. This archetype emerges when you need introspection or spiritual reset. Another is the wounded healer, an archetype that pushes you into retreat, so emotional wounds can surface and heal. Lying down creates the internal space for this archetype to work. A third is the Great Mother, which embodies nurturing safety and restoration. The ground symbolizes protection. By lying down, you unconsciously seek the stability and comfort that the external world is not providing. Jung believed these archetypes guide the psyche toward healing, even when the ego misunderstands the process. A powerful but often overlooked explanation for the desire to lie down is emotional abandonment of the self. Jung wrote that the soul rebels when a person neglects their own inner world for too long. If you constantly prioritize others, suppress your needs, ignore your intuition, or sacrifice your authenticity, your soul will eventually withdraw energy in protest. You feel exhausted not because of physical exertion, but because of emotional neglect. The soul collapses inward when it feels unseen, unheard, or dismissed by your conscious self. Lying down becomes a symbolic return to yourself. It is the only position where you can finally stop abandoning your emotions, your truth, and your vulnerability. Jung emphasized that the psyche demands connection with the self. If you fail to provide this connection consciously, the unconscious forces it through fatigue and withdrawal. Jung also believed that the urge to lie down can appear when you are approaching a psychological breaking point. The psyche senses danger long before the conscious mind does. When the unconscious detects that you are close to emotional overload, it withdraws your energy to prevent burnout, breakdown, or emotional collapse. You feel tired because your psyche is protecting you. Lying down becomes the unconscious trying to stabilize your internal system by slowing everything down. Jung compared this to the body's immune response when you are sick. The body induces fatigue to force you to rest so it can heal. The psyche works in the same way. Emotional overload triggers psychological fatigue, compelling you to lie down so internal conflicts can be processed safely. One of Jung's most important insights is that the desire to lie down often signals the beginning of individuation, the process of becoming your true self. Before a person transforms, they often experience periods of withdrawal, detachment, and energetic collapse. This is not regression, but preparation. Jung described it as the night sea journey, a descent into psychological darkness that precedes rebirth. During this phase, the psyche pulls energy away from external activities so it can redirect it inward. You feel like lying down because your soul is beginning a deep internal rearrangement. Relationships, priorities, values, and self-perception start shifting beneath the surface. This process consumes immense psychological energy, leaving little left for daily tasks. Lying down is not a failure, it is the first step of psychological evolution. Another reason lying down becomes appealing is the presence of unprocessed grief. Jung believed grief is one of the most powerful forces in the unconscious. Even if you consciously move on, grief remains stored in the shadow if not expressed. This hidden grief drains energy, causing chronic fatigue and emotional heaviness. You may feel the urge to lie down not because you are tired, but because grief is pulling you inward. Lying down becomes the only position where grief feels bearable. The ground holds you when emotions feel too heavy for the body to carry. Jung saw this not as weakness, but as the psyche's way of honoring loss. Finally, Jung taught that symptoms like the desire to lie down must be approached with respect. They are messages, not mistakes. The psyche speaks in symbols, and lying down is a symbol of collapse, surrender, introspection, rest, death, rebirth, and healing. If you feel like lying down all day, your soul is trying to tell you that something inside you is unresolved, unbalanced, or unacknowledged. The symptom is not the enemy. It is the guide. Jung believed that every psychological symptom contains wisdom. The desire to lie down invites you to listen to what you have ignored. It asks you to see the truth beneath your persona, to face your shadow, to process your grief, to question your life path, and to reconnect with your deeper self. Until this inner work begins, the urge to lie down persists not as punishment but as protection. Part 3. When you don't want to do anything, the inner shift. Preparing your soul for a major psychological transition. When a person reaches the point where they do not want to do anything, where even small tasks feel overwhelming, where the Kumarika, mind feels foggy, and the body feels slow, Jung would interpret this state not as simple laziness, but as a deep psychological transition. The human psyche does not shut down randomly. It withdraws energy from the outside world only when it needs that energy internally. Jung believed that there are moments in life when the unconscious pulls the ego inward, stopping the flow of motivation, desire, and outward engagement so the psyche can reorganize itself. This inward withdrawal often feels like apathy, numbness, or stagnation, but something profound is happening beneath the surface. Jung described this as creative hibernation, a period where the soul retreats to rebuild, restructure, and prepare for a new psychological phase. In modern society, people interpret inactivity as failure. Productivity is worshipped, stillness is judged, and rest is often seen as irresponsible. But Jung rejected this cultural narrative. He argued that the psyche has its own rhythms, its own timing, and its own needs. When you feel the urge to lie down and do nothing, your psyche might be in the process of shedding old beliefs, dissolving outdated identities, or releasing past emotional burdens. This invisible inner work consumes a tremendous amount of psychological energy. Because the unconscious is busy restructuring, the ego has very little energy left for external tasks. You feel heavy, uninspired, and uninterested in things that once motivated you. This is not regression, it is metamorphosis. Jung saw these phases of withdrawal as essential. They often appear before major breakthroughs in self-awareness. The psyche becomes silent on the surface because it is extremely active internally. This resembles the way nature works. Trees appear dormant in winter, while their roots grow deeper underground. Jung used this metaphor to explain psychological hibernation. When you feel like doing nothing, your roots are growing. The ego cannot see this growth because it happens in the unconscious, but the soul knows. It withdraws from external stimulation so it can focus inward. Jung believed that ignoring this inner pull leads to psychological conflict. When the soul wants stillness and the ego forces productivity, the result is anxiety, frustration, and emotional overload. Lying down becomes a form of alignment with the psyche's deeper timing. One important aspect of this inner transition is the dissolution of outdated structures in the psyche. Jung taught that the ego develops certain habits, patterns, and attitudes to survive earlier stages of life. These patterns become automatic, and even when they no longer serve you, you continue to live according to them. When the unconscious decides that it is time to release these outdated forms, it withdraws energy from them. You lose motivation not because you are weak, but because your old identity is losing its psychological fuel. The ego tries to continue acting as usual, but the psyche has already moved on. This misalignment creates the feeling that you cannot do anything. It is the psychological equivalent of trying to run on empty. Another layer of this withdrawal is the internal shift from the persona to the true self. The persona, the mask you show the world, may have served you for years, helping you fit in, perform, or keep peace. But eventually the persona becomes too limiting. It prevents you from stepping into your authentic path. Jung believed that the unconscious begins to challenge the persona when it is time for growth. During this challenge, your desire to participate in social obligations, external expectations, or routine roles diminishes. You feel disconnected from responsibilities, uninterested in pleasing others, and emotionally distant from things that once mattered. The ego interprets this as apathy, but the soul experiences it as liberation. The persona is losing its grip, and the true self is preparing to emerge. The desire to lie down symbolizes this loosening of the mask. Jung also explained that the psyche withdraws when it is processing emotional material from the past. Unresolved memories, traumas, disappointments, and suppressed feelings accumulate in the unconscious over time. When the psyche finally has the internal stability and strength to confront this material, it needs a tremendous amount of energy. This energy is pulled away from daily tasks, leaving you feeling tired and unmotivated. This is why emotional healing often appears as exhaustion. Before a breakthrough, the psyche enters a state of introspective heaviness. You may feel mentally foggy, emotionally flat, or physically weak. Jung believed that this is the unconscious preparing to bring repressed material to the surface. The desire to lie down is your soul bracing for emotional integration. During this phase, the unconscious is also reorganizing your psychological priorities. Values that once guided you may no longer resonate. Goals that once inspired you may now feel empty. People you once cared about may no longer align with your emotional truth. This rearrangement can make you feel lost or directionless. You may not know what you want or who you are becoming. Jung called this the suspension between identities. You are no longer the person you used to be, but not yet the person you are becoming. In this in-between state, the psyche slows down sometimes to a complete stop. The desire to lie down all day reflects this pause. The soul refuses to move forward until clarity returns. Jung emphasized that this state of inner limbo is not a mistake. It is a rite of passage. Every individual who undergoes psychological growth must pass through periods where everything feels empty or meaningless. The ego hates this phase because it cannot control it. But the unconscious uses this emptiness as fertile ground. It invites new meaning, new desires, and new motivations to form. During this period, doing nothing is not passive, it is receptive. The psyche is absorbing, evaluating, and gestating new possibilities. The desire to lie down becomes an intuitive surrender to this inner reorientation. Another critical aspect of Jung's perspective is the role of symbolic death in transformation. Before a new identity can emerge, the old one must dissolve. This symbolic death expresses itself as tiredness, disinterest, emotional flatness, and the urge to retreat from life. People often describe this feeling as losing themselves, but Jung would argue that they are losing only the parts that no longer belong to them. The psyche is killing off what is outdated. Lying down becomes the posture of surrender to this death. The ego resists, fearing the unknown, but the unconscious insists. Without this surrender, transformation cannot occur. The unconscious is also preparing you for new psychological potentials. New strengths, new insights, new desires, and new perspectives require space to grow. When your mind is filled with routines, demands, and external noise, there is no room for this growth. The psyche must therefore withdraw energy from the superficial layers of life to free space for deeper development. This withdrawal feels like apathy, but in reality it is preparation. Lying down is the psyche creating silence so new potentials can emerge. Jung compared this to clearing a room before renovating it. You must empty the space before you can rebuild it. Another profound explanation for the desire to withdraw is the integration of disowned aspects of the self. Jung believed that true healing occurs when you reconnect with the parts of yourself you previously rejected. Your vulnerability, your anger, your sensitivity, your intuition, your creativity, your longing, or your spiritual yearning. Integrating these parts requires internal dialogue, reflection, and emotional openness. These processes are subtle and energetically demanding. The psyche may push you into states of stillness so these inner voices can be heard. Doing nothing is not stagnation, it is listening. Jung taught that the soul often speaks most clearly in silence. Lying down therefore becomes a symbolic position of listening, listening to emotions, listening to intuition, listening to the unconscious. The desire to do nothing also appears when the unconscious senses that you are living out of alignment with your true nature. When your actions contradict your values, your relationships drain you, or your environment suffocates your emotional well-being, the psyche refuses to invest energy. You feel tired not because you lack strength, but because you are pursuing a direction that is not yours. Jung described this as the withdrawal of libido. Libido is psychological energy, and when the unconscious does not support your path, it pulls that energy back. Without libido, motivation disappears. Lying down becomes a natural consequence. The soul is saying, not this way, not this life, not this identity. Until you realign with your inner truth, the desire to withdraw continues. A major theme in Jung's work is the internal rebalancing between the masculine and feminine aspects of the psyche. The masculine principle represents action, logic, structure, and external achievement. The feminine principle represents intuition, rest, reflection, emotional depth, and inner awareness. Modern society overemphasizes the masculine principle, pressuring individuals to constantly produce, strive, and push forward. When the feminine principle becomes ignored or violated, the psyche compensates by forcing rest. The desire to lie down is the feminine principle reclaiming space. It demands introspection, stillness, and emotional reconnection. Jung believed that many psychological symptoms arise because people lose touch with their inner feminine regardless of gender. Lying down becomes a symbolic return to the inner world. Another reason for this withdrawal is the unconscious preparing to break attachments. People often remain tied to situations, relationships, and identities long after they have stopped being healthy. The psyche senses when an attachment is no longer aligned with your growth. Before you consciously recognize this, the unconscious starts detaching internally. This detachment demands energy. You feel distant, uninterested, or emotionally numb. Lying down becomes a way to conserve energy as the psyche loosens bonds that no longer serve you. Jung taught that the unconscious always moves toward wholeness, even when the ego resists. This invisible process can feel like depression, but it is actually liberation. Another element of this phase is the reorganization of the nervous system. Chronic stress, emotional suppression, and unresolved trauma overload the psyche. When the internal system reaches its limit, it forces shutdown. This shutdown is not punishment, it is repair. Lying down allows the nervous system to recalibrate. Jung observed that many psychological transformations begin with bodily symptoms. The body leads the process because the ego is too busy or too afraid to initiate it. The desire to lie down is the body taking responsibility for healing when the mind refuses to slow down. The transition Jung describes also involves the lowering of external stimulation. Modern life floods the psyche with noise, notifications, conversations, responsibilities, screens, deadlines, social expectations. The unconscious cannot reorganize itself amidst such chaos. It pulls the individual inward, removing interest in external stimuli. You feel like isolating, resting, or shutting off. Lying down is the psyche creating silence. This silence is the birthplace of insight. Without silence, there is no transformation. Jung also believed that during such phases, the psyche revisits old emotional layers. Trauma, childhood wounds, abandoned dreams, and forgotten desires re-emerge. This resurfacing is often unconscious. You may feel exhausted without knowing why. Your psyche is revisiting old emotional memories and integrating them. This process cannot happen when you are distracted, busy, or engaged with the world. Lying down is the psyche creating the necessary conditions for this inner revisiting. A powerful dimension of this withdrawal is the soul's preparation for new meaning. When you lose interest in old goals, relationships, or roles, it means meaning is shifting. Meaning is not created by the ego but discovered by the soul. The psyche must create emptiness before filling it with new purpose. Lying down becomes a symbolic clearing of old meaning. Jung wrote that the psyche cannot create meaning in a crowded inner world. First it must empty, then it can rebuild. In this phase, intuition becomes sharper. You may notice subtle feelings, symbolic dreams, inner impressions, or emotional impulses rising. These are the early signs of individuation. Lying down is the posture through which the unconscious communicates most easily. When your body is still, your inner world becomes louder. The desire to lie down, therefore, is not a sign of weakness, but a sign of psychological preparation. The psyche is restructuring itself, preparing for new identity, new meaning, and new direction. Jung believed that individuals who resist this phase suffer prolonged confusion and emotional pain. Those who surrender to it emerge transformed. Part 4: How to emerge from this state. Jungian healing, energy restoration, and reawakening the soul's inner direction. When a person spends long periods wanting to lie down, withdraw, or detach from the external world, Jung would argue that the external psyche is not only signaling distress, it is also preparing the individual for healing. But healing in Jungian psychology is never mechanical or forced. It is not about productivity hacks, motivational speeches, or rigid behavior changes. Instead, healing comes from alignment, integration, and reconnection with the deeper layers of the self. Jung believed that symptoms disappear not when you fight them, but when you understand what they are asking of you. The desire to lie down, once decoded, becomes a roadmap toward healing. The psyche does not sabotage you, it guides you. It withdraws energy from what is unhealthy and directs it toward what needs to be reclaimed. A core principle in Jung's approach to healing is the restoration of connection between the conscious mind and the unconscious. Fatigue, apathy, and withdrawal emerge when this connection is broken. To heal, the individual must rebuild this bridge. This requires self-listening, introspection, and honesty with one's inner truth. Jung emphasized that every psychological symptom is an attempt at communication. When you feel the desire to lie down, instead of judging it, the question becomes, what is my soul telling me? What am I avoiding? What emotional truth is rising? Healing begins when the symptom is taken seriously as a message rather than treated as an inconvenience. Jung often said that the unconscious whispers until it is ignored, then it starts shouting. Fatigue is one of these shouts. Listening to it is the first step of healing. One of the most important Jungian tools for this healing process is shadow dialogue. Since much of the exhaustion comes from repressed emotions or denied truths, the healing occurs when these emotions are given space to exist. Shadow dialogue does not mean indulging in negativity. It means acknowledging the real feelings you have. Suppressed anger, you never expressed grief. You never processed fear. You never admitted desires. You never honored exhaustion. You never validated. Bringing these emotions into awareness reduces their weight in the unconscious. Jung believed that what is made conscious no longer controls you. When you face your shadow, the burden that once drained your energy begins to dissolve. Another aspect of Jungian healing is the restructuring of the persona. When the persona becomes too rigid, too performative, or too disconnected from your true self, it drains psychological energy. Healing requires loosening this mask. This does not mean abandoning your responsibilities or becoming indifferent to the world. It means being honest about what roles drain you and what roles nourish you. Jung encouraged his patients to examine the personas they adopted in social life: the reliable one, the strong one, the accommodating one, the high-achieving one. Which persona is consuming your vitality? Which persona no longer reflects your truth? When you allow your persona to soften, the psyche releases new energy because it no longer has to defend a false identity. This is one of the most profound ways the desire to lie down can be healed, not by forcing yourself to act energized, but by removing the mask that exhausted you in the first place. Jung also taught that healing requires acknowledging lost meaning. When your life path no longer resonates with your deeper values, fatigue becomes the psyche's protest. The cure is not rest alone, it is reorientation. Jung believed that meaning is the greatest healer. People can endure suffering, setbacks, and hardship if they understand the purpose behind them. But when life becomes purposeless, the psyche collapses. Healing begins when you reconnect with meaning, not superficial goals, but authentic inner purpose. This often requires asking difficult questions. What do I truly care about? What activities make me feel alive rather than drained? What have I been doing only to please others? What dreams have I abandoned? What parts of myself have I silenced? The answers to these questions reawaken the psyche's flow of energy. Jung believed that the soul withdraws when you live falsely and returns when you live truthfully. An essential part of Jungian healing is the process of integration. Integration means bringing together the disconnected parts of your psyche, your shadow, your emotions, your intuition, your desires, your wounds, your strengths, into a unified self. Integration requires slowing down, reflecting, and allowing inner contradictions to exist without judgment. Many people feel exhausted because they try to be one-dimensional, strong but never vulnerable, productive but never still generous, but never angry, rational but never intuitive. This internal division drains energy. Integrating these opposites restores inner harmony. When you no longer fight yourself, your life force returns. The desire to lie down diminishes because your psyche is no longer fragmented. Jung believed that the unconscious communicates most clearly through symbolism. Healing, therefore, often involves interpreting these symbols. Dreams, intuitions, emotional reactions, and even physical impulses carry symbolic meaning. If you dream of falling, drowning, or collapsing, your psyche may be revealing emotional overload. If you dream of lying down, resting, or returning home, your psyche may be guiding you towards stillness. Jung taught that understanding these symbols transforms your relationship with your inner world. When you decode the symbolism behind fatigue, you no longer feel at war with yourself. Instead, you collaborate with your psyche. This collaboration is healing in itself. Another powerful healing method Jung used was active imagination, a technique where the individual deliberately enters a dialogue with the unconscious. Instead of suppressing feelings or thoughts, you allow them to speak. You imagine conversations with your emotions, your shadow, your inner child, or your future self. Through this process, unconscious material becomes conscious, and emotional wounds gain voice. Active imagination releases psychological tension. It restores the flow of energy that was previously blocked. This renewed flow reduces the desire to lie down because the psyche is no longer overwhelmed by unprocessed material. Jung also emphasized the importance of restoring balance between doing and being. Most people live entirely in the realm of doing tasks, responsibilities, goals, achievements. They ignore the realm of being presence, rest, reflection, inner awareness. When the psyche is deprived of being for too long, it forces the individual to stop. The desire to lie down is the psyche demanding being overdoing. Healing requires honoring this demand. This does not mean abandoning action permanently. It means rebalancing the two. Taking deliberate moments of stillness, practicing mindfulness, engaging in slow activities, or simply observing your emotional state without judgment helps restore psychological equilibrium. Jung believed that the psyche thrives when both action and contemplation coexist. Another crucial dimension of Jungian healing is the recovery of the inner feminine, the archetype of rest, intuition, creativity, and emotional depth. Regardless of gender, when the inner feminine is suppressed, the psyche becomes rigid, overworked, and exhausted. Restoring this feminine energy brings softness, gentleness, surrender, and emotional connection. The desire to lie down often emerges because the inner feminine has been ignored for too long. Healing requires reconnecting with this archetype. This may involve allowing yourself to feel emotions without suppressing them, trusting your intuition, slowing down when needed, engaging in creative expression, or nurturing yourself with compassion. When the inner feminine is honored, the psyche regains balance and fatigue begins to lift. Healing also involves reconnecting with the self, not the ego, not the persona, but the deeper essence of who you are. Jung believed that the self is the organizing center of the psyche. When you are disconnected from the self, you feel lost, tired, and numb. The desire to lie down is a symptom of this disconnection. Reconnecting with the self requires authenticity. It requires listening to your inner voice over external expectations. It requires embracing your wounds instead of hiding them. It requires courage to live in alignment with your truth. When you reconnect with the self, life no longer feels heavy. Energy returns not because you force it, but because you are finally living as who you truly are. Jung emphasized that healing does not come from fighting symptoms, but from understanding them. Fatigue is not the enemy. The urge to lie down is not an obstacle. They are signals. They are messages. They are invitations. When you honor the message, healing begins. When you ignore it, the symptom intensifies. Jung encouraged his patients to treat their symptoms with respect. Instead of asking, "Why am I so weak?" he encouraged them to ask, "What is my psyche trying to show me?" That shift in perspective transforms the entire healing process. A profound aspect of Jungian healing is the movement toward wholeness. Wholeness does not mean perfection. It means becoming complete, embracing every part of yourself, including the parts you previously rejected. When you move toward wholeness, internal conflict decreases and energy increases. The parts of you that once fought each other now cooperate. Wholeness creates psychological coherence. It restores vitality. It reduces numbness. It awakens motivation. It brings the psyche back into alignment. The desire to lie down diminishes because you no longer need to escape from your own internal battles. Healing also involves the cultivation of inner silence. Silence is not emptiness. It is nourishment for the psyche. Jung believed that the unconscious requires silence to reveal itself. When your life is filled with noise, distractions, and external demands, you cannot hear your inner voice. Lying down forces silence. But when silence is chosen instead of imposed, healing accelerates. Practicing conscious stillness, sitting quietly, breathing deeply, listening inwardly allows the psyche to reorganize itself without force. Silence heals the fragmentation caused by constant mental overstimulation. Another dimension of healing is reconnecting with the natural rhythms of life. Jung believed that individuals become sick when they live in a way that contradicts nature. Nature has cycles of activity and rest, growth and retreat, light and darkness. When you suppress your need for rest, your psyche suffers. When you force productivity during psychological winter, you collapse. Healing requires honoring your internal cycles. There are days for movement and days for stillness, seasons for outward engagement and seasons for withdrawal. When you align with your natural rhythm, fatigue becomes unnecessary because the psyche is no longer fighting your lifestyle. Jung also taught that healing often begins with small actions. When the psyche begins to restore energy, you may feel subtle impulses, the desire to step outside the pull to tidy your space, the urge to write, the curiosity to explore something new. These impulses are signs of reawakening. The key is not to force large leaps, but to honor small movements. Jung emphasized that psychological energy returns gradually. When you follow these small impulses, you encourage the psyche to continue its healing. Over time, these small actions accumulate into transformation. Another core aspect of Jungian healing is reconnecting with creativity. Creativity is the language of the unconscious. Drawing, writing, singing, painting, storytelling, music, movement, all of these allow the psyche to express itself beyond logic. When people are disconnected from creativity, they lose contact with their deeper emotions. Creativity restores flow. It unlocks energy. It gives voice to the shadow. It brings meaning into emptiness. Jung often had patients create art not for beauty, but for psychological integration. When you engage in creativity, the heaviness that pushed you to lie down begins to lift. Healing also requires rebuilding boundaries. Many people become exhausted because they have no psychological protection. They give too much, absorb too much, say yes too often, tolerate too much, and carry burdens that are not theirs. Jung emphasized that being boundaryless drains the psyche. Reclaiming your boundaries, learning to say no, walking away from toxicity, protecting your inner space, conserves energy and restores strength. Fatigue decreases when your energy is no longer leaking into places it does not belong. Another healing element in Jungian psychology is movement, not forced, but natural movement. Jung believed that the psyche expresses itself through the body. Gentle walking, stretching, breathing exercises, or simple physical actions stimulate the flow of psychological energy. Movement helps integrate emotional material. It clears stagnation. It reconnects the body with the mind. This is why even small physical actions during a period of withdrawal can create profound shifts. Moving slowly, intentionally, and intuitively helps guide the psyche back to vitality. Finally, Jung believed that healing ultimately requires courage, the courage to face yourself, to change your life, to release what is unhealthy, to embrace your truth, and to trust your soul's direction. The desire to lie down gradually fades when you reclaim your courage. Not the courage to push through exhaustion, but the courage to live authentically. Courage is the psychological antidote to stagnation. When you take courageous steps toward alignment, energy returns because the psyche supports your direction. Healing in Jungian depth psychology is not about eliminating symptoms, it is about restoring wholeness. The desire to lie down disappears not because you fight it, but because you no longer need it. When your psyche is aligned, your energy flows. When your self is integrated, your mind becomes clear. When your meaning is restored, your soul reawakens. And when your life matches, your truth standing becomes natural again. Your desire to lie down was never a weakness, it was a message. When you listen to it, you begin healing. When you honor it, you evolve. If today's video helped you understand yourself more deeply, remember the soul always speaks and you are finally learning how to hear it.